our planet Earth. A world of mystery and imagination, science and wonder that is constantly being gazed upon and unraveled by the finest minds humanity has to offer. Welcome to the UniV podcast, the show that presents a free-flowing conversation with those beings at the very center of the world of academia and research from all around the globe, with your host, Simon Holland.
Hello and welcome to the show. Our guest today is Professor Andrew Derocher. He is a professor of biology at the University of Alberta and a long-time scientific advisor to the PBI. He holds a BS from the University of British Columbia, an MS from the University of Alberta, and a PhD from the University of Alberta. His field research focuses on polar bears in the Canadian Arctic and the polar bears of Hudson Bay. He has also worked with polar bears in Svalbard, Norway, through the Norwegian Polar Institute. Over the course of more than 20 years studying polar bears, Dr. Derocher's research is focused on limiting and regulating factors of polar bear populations, including habitat use, harvest effects, and predator-prey relationships. His current work includes assessment of the effects of climate change and toxic chemicals on polar bears. He is the author of Polar Bears, A Complete Guide to Their Biology and Behavior. Welcome to the show, Andrew Derocher.
Good day. How are you doing down there?
I was actually just looking at your Google citations, and I guess where you can deviate with your research within a field all over the place, you've really honed in. And what is it about polar bears that kind of got you started?
Well, I actually was born in Vancouver, British Columbia, so I was a kid that grew up in the coast in a rainforest. And I don't think I had any sights on ever studying polar bears. I mean, I was working on grizzly bears when somebody suggested they knew somebody that worked on polar bears. Would I be interested? And that certainly sounded intriguing. And next thing I know, I was studying polar bears. And I kind of have the feeling almost like polar bears chose me as much as anything else. I could have studied anything in the natural world. I have diverse interests in ecosystems and different species. For some reason, polar bears and I just clicked. I'm pretty good at studying them, and they are a fascinating species to be able to spend time with and to write and think about. In preparation, we're going to bed last night. I listened to a podcast from National Geographic with Jane Goodall, the primatologist who worked with chimpanzees and gorillas and the rest of it. And she sort of said how she got into it. She kind of wandered in and immersed herself. They got used to her and they yelled at her at the start and kind of warmed to her, and then she could study them from within. You can't really do that, can you? Not if you want to do it for more than a little while. When you're talking about polar bears, I mean, you're always keeping one eye over your shoulder. They are, they've got millions of years of expertise at sneaking around trying to find things to kill and eat. And out on the sea ice where we do a lot of our work, I mean, we're just another potential meal ticket for them. And so in that respect, they are really not easy to study. They're usually far away from where people live, so we're quite often out in their habitat by helicopter, which means it's expensive as well. Mm-hmm. And we sort of gain small glimpses of pieces of their life history and ecology as we're out there doing our research. So it's a challenging species, and it's one that if you went to parts of the range right now, you'd be hard-pressed to even see them because, of course, it's still 24 hours of darkness at the very high reaches in the Arctic. So it's a tough place to be, and it's odd. I don't actually like being cold, so it was an odd choice for me in that respect as well.
Yeah. Do you look at the adaptations and you just kind of get a little jealous?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I mean, if you actually see what they ate for dinner, it's not something that I'd be that jazzed about. Probably most people wouldn't either. I mean, we think about polar bears as sort of being the largest terrestrial carnivore. Well, it's wrong on two fronts when you use that terminology. First of all, they're not really a terrestrial species at all. They're really more of a marine mammal. And then the other one is carna, if you actually translate it as carnivore, well, carna means meat, and they actually don't eat very much meat. What makes a polar bear tick is eating fat. So when they kill seals, mainly ringed and bearded seals, it's that fat that really makes it possible for the bears to be bears in a place where it's so incredibly cold. So the way I've often describe polar bears is think of them more as a fat vacuum that goes around the Arctic, catching seals, sucking the fat, putting it in their own fat cells, and that's how they make a living.
So it's like a polar bear fight club.
It is totally. And when you get down to it, it's incredibly successful way to be. And if you look at people that live in really cold climates, of course they do gravitate to high fat diets because you just need the energy to be able to maintain normal body temperature and processes when it's that cold.
So your expeditions, they must be, I guess, relatively seasonal because there's hibernation. If you look at the documentary David Attenborough's Planet Earth, and I think everyone who's into this kind of stuff must have seen this documentary. The first episode's called Pole to Pole, and they really kick off with polar bears emerging from hibernation. The little ones rolling down the hill and cleaning their fur. And is that what it looks like when you first get out there for the polar bear season?
Well, it depends on what projects we're doing at any given time. And one of the things, natural history films always give you that nice sort of insight. One thing about polar bears is it's only the pregnant females that go into dens and overwinter. All the other bears, they're incredibly tough, and they're out there right through the dead of winter walking around trying to find something to eat. So there is a lot of seasonality to our work. We usually want to be out doing our work when females with small cubs have emerged. Some populations in Canada will just be coming out of their dens with cubs, I would say, in about 2 weeks from now. They'll be starting to trickle out. At higher latitudes, they'll still be a month from coming out onto the sea ice. So we're out there typically in the springtime, sometimes in the fall, depending on the population. Some of the populations, of course, spend the summer on land. Some of them spend the summer out on the sea ice. So it depends on where we are. It's always sort of depending on the question that we're asking at any given time. And a lot of our research right now is focused on trying to understand polar bears relative to their sea ice habitat and what the loss of that habitat will mean for them in the future.
I guess that's something that particularly a reason we want to speak to you. Kind of almost by accident, our first 3 episodes have been with biologists. We started with John Hutchinson, who's a biomechanist and studies dinosaur locomotion. Alex Greenwood works with ancient DNA and woolly mammoths. And I guess talking to you now really bookends is an indication of the future, and you're looking at potentially how the world's working and where it's going, not the extinctions from the past, but the extinctions possibly from the future. Is that something that you feel when you're looking at a climate so sensitive to climate change?
Yeah, it is. It definitely is an issue. And, when I first got involved in polar bears and sort of large mammal ecology, I never expected that, number one, that the planet would be changing as fast as it currently is. And even once I started to sort of gather that climate change was an issue back in the 1980s, it seemed like a very distant problem. And the first paper that I wrote with a co-author, Ian Sterling, back in 1993 that addressed polar bears in a warming climate, we sort of examined what the future might hold for polar bears should the climate be warming. And it was kind of a very far away idea. And now, of course, as we move ahead a few decades here, we're looking at a planet and a habitat, in particular in the Arctic, that is changing at a phenomenal rate. And the simplest way to understand the threat to polar bears going forward is it's no different than the risk that most species at risk face, and that is just a habitat loss issue. When you look at the distribution of polar bears, it's been dynamic over long periods of time. If we go back 10,000 years, we used to have polar bears down around Denmark and southern Sweden. Of course, that was a cold period, and it was an ice age, and the sea ice was very far south, and then as the climate warmed, the bears went back north. The problem is now we've got this directional warming that just keeps taking away more and more sea ice every year. And so the challenge is, how many more years do the bears have? In that context, as a conservation biologist, we tend to work with what we call a 3-generation rule. It's kind of an international standard for assessing the threat to a species. And for polar bears, that puts us into a time frame of 36 to about 45 years into the future. And what does that look like for polar bears? Well, we rely on sea ice scientists and climatologists to give us their best estimates of what the world will look like. And based on those estimates, it's pretty clear that we're going to lose at least half of the polar bears that we currently have, and we're going to see a massive retraction in their distribution that will probably really only have viable populations in the very high reaches of the Arctic and northern parts of Greenland, for example.
And by viable, do you mean sustainable for polar bears themselves?
Yeah, exactly. So a long-term viable population, one that has enough breeding individuals to reduce the likelihood of sort of these random events that occur in very small populations. Of course, that's predicated on us doing our part in terms of controlling greenhouse gases going forward. If we kind of follow the business as usual model that we're currently on, it gets considerably worse than that. The future looks pretty grim for a lot of Arctic species, and polar bears would just be one of the species that would likely blink out if we don't change our ways to some extent anyways.
I think the conversation with climate change, I mean, this isn't obviously, there's 7 billion people and this isn't a global conversation everybody's have, but we must know that it's happening by this point and we can show that it's happening. I guess getting the information out there is a completely different kettle of fish from knowing that it's happening. But I think what a lot of people, just like you were saying before, a lot of people didn't realize it was happening so fast. And I guess you're in the prime position to actually see just how fast it is. What do you feel that people need to know to be able to, how fast do we need to put a plan into action?
Well, I'm just a kind of a lowly polar bear biologist, and I've studied the bears, and I think they have given us a pretty clear signal of what the future holds for the bears. And the way I always come down to it is I'm not really an advocate for polar bears per se. I'm an advocate for people understanding the science about polar bears and what do we understand about this species and what the future looks like for polar bears going forward in time. So in that respect, it's pretty clear that it's a societal issue, whether people really want to buy, big gas-burning trucks, live in big houses, and, keep flying to all the vacations and using up carbon resources as we currently are, or would they rather pull back the throttle a little bit and say, look, we need to be smarter about how we're living on this planet. And ultimately, it does, as you mentioned, comes down to how many people can we really sustain on this planet going forward. And currently, with our high carbon lifestyles, it certainly we're beyond the sustainable limit at this time, from what I can see. But I really try to stay to the polar bear science and what the climate scientists are telling us, and that I think is a pretty worrisome future for generations down the road. And one of the things I always tell my students when I'm lecturing about climate change in the context is, I'm going to be fertilizer by the time the real impacts of climate change come to the fore. And at that stage, we're not going to be worried about, trying to keep viable populations of polar bears alive, although we could do that. What we're really going to be worried about is sort of the societal consequences of food and water and mass migration of humans across this planet. It has the potential to be quite disruptive, and I think the issues surrounding polar bears at that stage are probably going to be diminishing quite rapidly. We just won't have the resources to go out and perhaps feed polar bears in the wild to ensure that we have some there. We won't have the ability to do that, would be my expectation.
Now, you're doing pretty good on social media, doing a pretty good job on social media. You have quite a fun Twitter feed to follow that I've been following for a little while now. And you have you put up some really good stuff about the polar bear, such as there was a map of sea ice and you had which path takes less energy, and there was one that was just sort of crossing the sea ice, and then one where the bear had to deviate swim a bit and sort of took a roundabout way to get where they needed to go. It was like, which one uses more energy or something like that. I think you're creating something that has potential that people can, very shareable, very interactive, especially on Twitter, social media. Is that a conscious kind of thing?
It is, and sometimes I guess there's, polar bears have been the target of the climate change deniers, partly because the story is so easy to understand, and the understanding of polar bear ecology and how they live in their environment is so well-founded. We have had international research programs in the circumpolar Arctic for decades now. We really know this species well. And so that's made polar bears a target for a lot of the denier groups, some politicians in the United States, some what I would call pseudoscientists that like to sort of take random tilts at polar bear biology and polar bear biologist. And so some of those graphics are sometimes just a small sort of element of frustration from the deniers. And I just think, look, this is how simple it really is. It's not complicated, folks. And that's why, I was at a grade 1 class just a couple of weeks ago giving a talk to a bunch of little kids, and they understand it. They get the issue that polar bears need a place to live. And yet you get these politicians in the States, and actually, I hate to say it, in Canada and other countries around the world that refuse to sort of even get past the point that the climate is warming, or they come up with some fanciful sorts of points like, well, polar bears will just adapt. Why won't they just adapt? And of course, we don't see undoing millions of years in evolution in sort of periods of decades. It just doesn't work like that. So there is sort of occasional sort of poke in the eye to some of these deniers in the context of, Twitter's a good way to get a message out and to reach other people. I try to stay to the polar bear science for the most part, but every so often I must confess my frustration just kind of burbles over, and I just, say, look, this is what it's like, and it's not that hard to follow. But nonetheless, information isn't necessarily what changes people's mind.
Absolutely. And also argument, that what you were touching on before. I mean, I can't think of a time where my mind has been changed just from argument alone without new information being shown, or if that works for anybody. But you sort of touched on the point that kind of needs to happen with working with the kids, and they just get it. Maybe the next generation automatically can kind of get it because they didn't have that transaction period, and they have the inspiration where you talk to them early. Do you feel that when you talk to that generation?
Yeah, I think I think we all grow up with that sort of wonderment of the natural world, and then I think we sort of lose it as we get a bit older. And I think probably more and more, a lot of people are losing that with an urban lifestyle and spending less time outdoors as kids. And I think that there is hope for the next generation understanding the problem more fully because, the science curriculum has it here in Canada, and most countries discuss it in a rational way now. So it's a little bit of a transition. The problem I think we've got is it's basically the older generations that need to pay the price for what's been done. And, of course, they're largely unwilling. So a lot of the baby boomers really have to start saying, we have to start looking at serious carbon taxes. We have to look at repairing some of the damage that's been done, and we have to do it in a radical way. So I'm optimistic that we can make the changes as long as we have the political leadership. And in Canada, we just had a change in government that's taking the problem of climate change very seriously. And so we'll see just whether or not them taking it seriously translates into policy and action. But on the face of it, we're in a very different world right now in Canada, and that bodes well. But I think more or less people do get it now, and one of the things that really changes people's mind is once they see climate change in their own backyard. Right now, where I am in Edmonton in Alberta, we're having an incredibly warm year. And of course, it's not just being warm as an indicator of climate change. It can actually be colder than normal as an indicator of climate change. At least at these latitudes, we have things like the polar vortex. And these sorts of changes aren't what people are used to. And once you push people outside of their sort of what I'm used to, it really does change people's perceptions. And on the prairies here, we do have a lot of grain farmers, and they talk about drought now, and they're seeing conditions that they've never seen before. In some years, they're seeing fields that are just so wet that they can't plant their crops, and in other years, it's so dry they can't grow them. So one of the hallmarks of climate change, and one of the things we're really seeing in our polar bear data as well, is that the amount of variation in the climate and in the weather and in the species responses is just so all over the place. It's really clear that we're not in sort of the same sort of scenario that we used to be for a lot of different species. And we see it in polar bears. We've had several really poor years of polar bear conditions, so how fat the bears were over in western Hudson Bay in Canada here. And yet last year, the bears were in pretty good shape, but that was a response to this polar vortex that sucked down a lot of cold air from the Arctic, and the bears responded pretty much as we would have expected. But the problem is we've got a population that's down by 30 to 40% over the last couple of decades, and one good year doesn't grow you back to where you were. This is a species that grows incredibly slowly, only a few percent per year. So to recover that deficit would be, probably decades away, and we're not going to see ongoing cold conditions. All projections are that population won't even exist by mid-century.
One of the things you posted on Twitter is a polar bear body condition and a qualitative index from 1 to 5. And it's got a catchy phrase, fat is where it's at. So it sort of marks polar bears from sort of a large-ish, cuddly-looking thing down to almost like a sloth wearing polar bear suit. What sort of things are you seeing at the moment?
Well, it depends. And again, this last year when I was out doing some work with the bears, it was interesting. I mean, I saw one male that was basically right up there with the 5, the 5 out of 5, as fat as a bear really can get at that time of the year. And then right after that, saw a bear that would have been well down on the 2 scale, like really just skinny. And, as I mentioned, fat is really what drives these animals. And, if a polar bear had its choice, it would never come on land. They would stay out on the sea ice all year round. And the other thing is they would never stop eating. I mean, no polar bear ever looked at its reflection in a little puddle and said, I'm too fat. They just don't do that. They just keep eating and eating and eating. And that's the whole strategy for a bear. And, they can eat so much in a good year that sometimes they can actually carry some of that weight forward in future years as well. So they basically have their own, refrigerator with them. It's just packed up inside their fat cells, and that's the energy they take with them. And while they can go long periods of time without food, there are limits to how far you can push them, and it's tied to how much sea ice there is, which is what gives them the access to their prey.
Is there a particular way they eat? I mean, you said before they go for the fat, so they must be very specific when they kill something or what they're looking for. How do they tend to what sort of prey do they have, and how do they go about extracting what they need?
Well, this is exactly the sort of deal for a bear. And, if they catch an adult seal, a ring seal could be up to 70 kilos and a bearded seal up to 400 kilos. But when they get them, it's basically, you sort of got to think they're not really interested in the skin, and they're not really interested in the meat. What they really want to eat is that blubber layer that sits in between. And it's kind of what I call the Oreo cookie effect. They're not sort of interested in the top nor the bottom. They just want the middle. And so what they do is they peel open these seals, and then they just scrape the fat out. And, a polar bear can eat about 20% of its body mass in a single meal. So if you get a big male polar bear, it could be 500 kilograms, kills a big bearded seal, rips it open, and just scoops out the fat, they could easily take in 100 kilograms of fat over a period of time that they're feeding on it, like could be hours. And from there, out of that 100 kilos, about 94 kilos is going to go directly onto their own body, pretty much unmodified. So it just goes in their stomach, in their bloodstream, deposited into the fat cells. And so, as humans, we fuss about, 1 or 2 meals of excess, too many French fries or something. But for a polar bear, that's really what it is just gorging when the food is there. And you don't need a lot of seals. You don't have to kill a lot of seals to be able to fill up your fat cells. So it's a boom and bust situation for the bears, and most of their feeding occurs during a very small window in the springtime, sort of March, April, May. And it depends on the sea ice conditions at that time of year will really dictate how that population is doing and whether or not a female will have enough fat to produce cubs, and whether or not individuals will have enough fat to survive the leaner periods of the year, which is pretty much another 9 months of the year when they can sometimes kill seals, but not very often.
And how would a practical expedition work from your point of, from say preparation? You said the first thing, I guess, with all science is you ask the question. How do you take it from there to progress?
Well, yeah, the biggest question I think probably for most scientists is, do we have enough money to ask the questions? That's always our rub point for polar bear research. It's one of the most expensive types of research for wildlife that we do because we're so reliant on having helicopters as our baseline of support. Quite often we work with technology like satellite telemetry, so we're putting out collars with GPSs on our bears so we can follow them. But the basic premise is that for understanding an Arctic ecosystem is you need long-term data series. So most of the types of studies in the places where I've been doing my research, we're trying to get a time series so we can detect changes in a population over time. So we're also working sometimes to find new ways to get insights. So are there less invasive methods that we can apply to understanding what the bears are doing? Are there things that we could collect from their hair, for example? So if we can get a hair sample, can we look at things like stress hormones in their hair? We're basically trying to get some early warning techniques to tell us that a population might be in trouble. At the same time, to some extent, we're just documenting what's happening to the bears. So in a lot of our work, we're trying to understand the dynamics, how many cubs are born, how many are surviving, which bears are producing more cubs, which are not. We have, in some of our populations, we have a very in-depth pedigree of the population as well. So we've had, over the last 40 years, several thousand polar bears go through various research programs, and each one of them have had a DNA sample collected. So now we can start to look at the pedigree, so which bears are producing more cubs and which bears are actually surviving better. And then within that, we're also trying to look at which genes might be being expressed under changing environmental conditions in these different populations. So a lot of the questions that we ask are sometimes post hoc. We never thought about this, but we collected the samples and we can look at the issue because we have large freezers full of tissues that we've collected over the years. But very often we go out with a dedicated question. And one of the burning ones we have right now is, we talk about habitat loss. How much is too much for a bear before we'll start to see a population come undone? And so that's one of the driving things that we're working with and trying to combine different methodologies. So we use sea ice modeling, we use remote sensing, we use energetics modeling, we use population modeling as well to try to get some sense of where these populations are particularly vulnerable.
How have you found the governments in that region stepping up to the plate with things like breeding programs? Are polar bears receptive to something like that? In
terms of breeding polar bears in the wild or for in captivity for release in the wild?
Yeah, or either just breeding in general.
In terms of sort of the interventionist side, we're not really at that stage for the most part. For most polar bear populations, we're still relying on natural recruitment into the population to maintain the numbers. The problem is we're not set up to deal with polar bears for the most part from a captive scenario. So there's very little that we can expect from zoos in the short term. In the longer term, we may be actually looking to zoos as sort of a genetic repository for trying to maintain some of the diversity in wild populations. And one of the problems we've got for polar bears is they're not very genetically diverse. So if we end up with very few individuals left in the wild, very quickly we could see negative implications from inbreeding, depression, things like that. So there's quite a lot of reluctance in the north right now, I would say, to sort of look that far ahead. A few years ago, myself and several colleagues looked at what some of our potential actions could be to deal with climate change. So would we move bears from the south to areas further north? That would have benefits of taking them from a place where they're no longer able to thrive and also increasing genetic diversity in the north. Would we just shoot bears that were too sick or starving? Nobody wants to see an animal suffer, but there's no policies in place or programs in place to say, well, look, that bear's not going to live. Let's just put it out of its misery. Would we feed bears? Would we go out and actually create large piles of bear food to try to get some of these populations through very lean times? So we're not at that stage yet, and there is a fair bit of reluctance from some governments to sort of start to ponder some of those issues. I think once we get a little further down the road here, and when we start to see more populations really in dire conditions, I think that's when we'll see managers start to reconsider what we're going to do moving forward.
When I was searching to see if there's any polar bear specific podcasts out there, and there's only 3 podcasts, and 2 of them were random things with podcasts in the title, and the other one was Coca-Cola, something about Coca-Cola's polar bear. Have you tapped that source for research money? I mean, it had a TM on it, so I'm assuming they've tried to claim polar bears. They need to be invested now in keeping them around.
Yeah, we have in the past had some funding from Coke. To tell you the truth, most scientists will take money from almost anyone. It doesn't control what we do nor how we do it, but we've had it from non-governmental organizations. We've had it from industry. We've had money from research councils. The biggest grant I've ever had actually was from the U.S. government to study some issues about polar bears relative to oil development in the Arctic. So, it's a challenge always to keep this place running, and I think it's probably no different for almost any academic these days to try to keep our research programs moving.
Do you feel pressure if you get a grant like that to come up with a result one way or the other? I know that's complete polar opposite of what you want from science, but do you feel that pressure? Is there pressure from a management level?
The one nice thing is I have worked in government before, and I was actually a polar bear biologist for the Norwegian government for 7 years. And when you're working in government, there's a lot more pressures inside the system. One of the things I've got to say about being an academic is the freedom to be able to speak about issues freely. Without fear. And you have to remember, like, living in Canada, in Alberta, this is a petroleum province here. We are driven by the tar sands and natural gas production, and it's you think it might be unpopular, but in reality, I've never in my career as an academic felt any external pressure on anything. People may not like what we say, but I've never had anybody sort of try to change what we say. And it's an interesting phenomenon. I think when you work inside government, you find there's a lot more massaging of messages, to be politically correct. And yet, in academia, we really are free to make inferences and basically professional judgments about the data that we collect. And then present that to a broad audience. So it's always kind of surprised me that as a polar bear scientist, I've actually found employment in Alberta, which is, of course, a fairly conservative province when you get right down to it. But at the same time, polar bears sort of cross all boundaries in that respect. And I think even the most sort of fervent sort of conservatives out there understand that protecting the natural world is the right thing to do, and we may differ on some of the fine points. And I think people really are starting to understand the climate change issue now more fully. So, but yeah, from the perspective of pressure on our research, none at all. It's I don't know what I would actually do if it did happen. It would probably freak me out so much that I probably wouldn't know what to do. But fortunately, it's never happened to me.
I guess that's why I kind of started this podcast, is I thought there's a lot of information, and I didn't want to be an echo chamber on, say, Facebook or something like that, where I've just got people that I like what they're saying, and I agree with what they're saying, and I delete all the people that I don't like, and I'm left with just this kind of echo chamber of information that rebounds and it's not necessarily correct. And that goes for both the left and the right. People that want to conserve and then people that are sort of going, don't worry about it. They probably exist in their own echo chambers like that. Is there something about these polar bears that you find, specifically I wanted to speak to you and get the best information? Is there any myths out there used on either side that you think that you want to dispel, things that drive you a little bit bananas?
Well, I think it, probably this idea that somehow polar bears are going to adapt to climate change. If they were going to adapt to climate change, we would still have polar bears in southern Scandinavia. We'd have them in Finland. We just don't see that potential moving forward. This is a highly specialized species that's really dependent on one or two prey species that rely on sea ice. And it just doesn't get any simpler. It's a habitat loss issue, and you can look at any number of websites from NASA to the National Snow and Ice Data Center. Look at their projections and the trends on sea ice, and it's not complicated. But again, I think because it is such a simple story, people really who don't want to believe it do everything they can to sort of fight against the issue, and so that's probably the most disheartening thing, is seeing people try to twist the data. And these aren't polar bear scientists for the most part. These are people that are paid lobbyists. They're paid by some of the denier groups, the far right-wing sorts of agencies that are trying to foment doubt. And I guess they always figured if they could foment doubt in the polar bear story, then it would really be sort of, the nail in the coffin for the whole climate change debate, which it never has been nor never would be. But they've sort of taken it that way. And so, it's like, you see the denier groups, and they went after the former Vice President Al Gore about, polar bears drowning. That was always sort of taken to be a fallacy in that movie. And, we're looking at our data now, and we've got a paper coming out soon that shows that polar bears are swimming a lot more now than they used to. So within that context, bears swimming long distances isn't a real problem, but it is a problem if you're a small cub and you're forced to swim long distances in cold water. They suffer hypothermia and they die. A big storm comes up and the weak bears don't survive. So again, we're changing the rules by which the bears have to live, and at some point they just can't play by our rules, and that's the challenge going forward for this species anyway.
I feel like one of the myths that drives me a little bananas is when you hear people talk about things like bears, and they're like, oh, they're so cute, just want to cuddle them, and they just look so cuddly. But I mean, you see a different perspective, don't you? I saw The Revenant, and I think that sort of changed any misconceptions about what a bear would happen to you if you ran into a bear. I think was pretty accurately portrayed in that movie. Is that how you feel about that kind of thing? Do you see what the bears kind of, how they hunt and how they look at you if they catch you unawares?
Well, it's kind of interesting because, polar bears are pretty darn relaxed when it comes to the bear world. If you gave me a choice between running into a grizzly bear or a polar bear, I'd take a polar bear any day. They're just as likely to look at you and walk away, whereas a grizzly bear is just as likely to walk away or tear a strip off you, but probably just as likely the latter as the former. And, the thing with polar bears, and people always say, oh, they look so beautiful. And yeah, this is a carnivore. They are a killing machine. That's how they make their living. And, and I talk to people all the time, and they say, oh, I've been out and I've seen, hundreds of polar bears, and, none of them have ever caused me any problems. And I go, yeah. And that's the problem. It's only one bear in 1,000 perhaps that causes a problem, that really decides it wants to eat a person. And, if you're just your average tourist, you wander out into polar bear habitat, the problem is it might be the first bear or the 1,000th bear that you see that causes a problem and attacks you, and they can do some serious damage or kill you. But definitely, eventually, it's going to be the last polar bear you ever see. And that's the problem, is they will kill people. They do kill people. There's some pretty good indication that the number of human-bear conflicts is increasing across the Arctic as a whole. It makes sense. The bears are spending more time on land. That's where people live. A lot of small communities have a lot of good bear attractants that bring bears right into town. And the bottom line is, bears are the same everywhere. They look for food. That's kind of what they do. And if you get a hungry bear in your neighborhood, it's going to be trouble. So, I've never been impressed by the idea. I wanted to really just hang around with polar bears. When we're out there, we have lots of guns and dart guns and drugs, and we're in helicopters. And I tell you, you'd better be keeping a close eye over your shoulder if you want to stay in this business.
Do you feel a pressure then to get on the treadmill when it comes up to expedition season? You don't want to appear too fat rich or anything like that to a polar bear. Maybe choose a very low profile coat. So you
just choose really slow moving graduate students.
Yeah, I was going to say that could be a very effective anti-obesity campaign in children.
Yeah, it might be. Unfortunately, I think I'm getting so old that probably just take a couple of my students and push me over and say, "There's the sacrifice, run."
Hey, Andrew, thank you very much for being on the show. And for the listeners out there, I recommend following Andrew's Twitter feed. It's very entertaining and informative. And also, Google Scholar is very kind to you, Andrew. If you type in your name, pretty much get a pretty healthy serve of papers and citations that you can use. Just before we go, I just had a look, and you deviated just quickly into wolves. What sort of work are you doing on there now?
Yeah, a little bit. We don't do a lot of work on wolves. It was a project that we've been working on for a number of years. We were looking at less invasive techniques to try to monitor populations and structure of wolves in Alberta here. I've done wolves work in the high Arctic as well. I'll work on almost any large mammal. Polar bears are pretty much what I spend most of my days doing now. But we do some work on grizzly bears and caribou and even peregrine falcons. I've got eclectic interest. Like I say, the bears kind of chose me, and they're kind of my number one species. But at the same time, being an academic and having a vibrant research group, having that sort of diversity here is really important, sort of to have that feedback from one student that's working on a very different system. It creates that sort of thrill of discovery and integration and different ideas that makes it really fun to place to work and to interact with these really bright young people.
Now, finally, as a call to action, if people want to get involved and people want to help out your efforts, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the number one thing is, I always come back to it. It's understanding the issue. And if you understand the issue and the science behind climate change, it's a really good way to get a foundation. There's lots of really good websites that can give you that sort of baseline information. There's also a lot of really bad ones that'll give you just as much misinformation. One of the groups that I work with and volunteer my time with is a group called Polar Bears International. And they have some really excellent resources, lots of good links. For teachers, they have good sort of course planning work that they can follow. It's a really solid group that really provides some basics. I have also volunteered with the World Wildlife Fund as well, another group that does a lot of good work, a lot of on-the-ground work to try to reduce polar bear conflict and the number of bears that are killed around communities, for example. So those are two groups that I think give people at least a toehold in the polar bear world. And from there, I tell you, you put Google to work, and you'll find no end of information out there. And if somebody can't find an answer to their question, I tell you, I've answered hundreds and hundreds of emails from kindergarten right through to university students. If you can't find an answer, I'd be surprised, but you can always give me a try.
Andrew Derocher, thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Well, it's been my pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, that was Professor of Biological Sciences at the University of Alberta, Andrew Derocher. Polar bears have been his main study for 30 years, and he's incredibly active in the scene. I do encourage you to follow his Twitter, which is twitter.com/AEDerocher, DEROCHER, to stay in touch and some very likable and very shareable links. Well, that's a wrap for episode 3 of the Univ podcast. So stay in touch via Twitter or Facebook. And if there's anybody that you'd particularly like us to speak to, drop us a line, and we're happy to have any conversation anytime. Catch you later.
Well, that's all we have time for this week. Thank you for listening to the Univ podcast. To follow our series, please subscribe to our channel via iTunes, Beyond Pod, or the equivalent service. And if you particularly enjoyed the show, please don't forget to rate. For further information, news, videos, and articles, head to univ.com.au.